Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 9:01, so in the interest of staying on time, which is the impossible task, at least for me, we'll get started now. Welcome to the 9th Annual Montreal Oscillometry Seminar. It's great to see all of you folks here once again, and for those of you who are new, welcome. Let's get this advancing. Should work. Here we go. So so room 303 is our new home in the McIntyre Medical Building, or as the students like to call the McIntyre McMed. And in my opinion, it's one of the best rooms on the planet for such a meeting, because the folks online sound like they're in the room with us, even though they're not. And last year's seminar, and I apologize, oh, what did I do? Okay, slide's a little bit off, but no, nonetheless, last year's seminar statistics, I was very happy with the participation. We had 182 folks from 19 countries, and this year it's going to be substantially bigger. We had about 60 people in person last year, and last count, we're up to 82 today. We have 75 people signed in virtually as of yesterday, but more have signed in, and often people come in unannounced, which is fine, you're welcome. 71 institutions in 17 countries. And we're coming to you live from McGill campus, downtown Montreal, nestled against the slopes of Mount Royal, from which you see Montreal on the right-hand side. And that round building in the foreground is, in fact, the McIntyre Medical Building, where we are right now. We're on the 3rd floor. The entrance picture there is on the 6th floor. And 2 minutes away is the Graduate Student Society residence Thompson House, where we're going to have the supper and networking cocktail tonight. Unfortunately, the terrace, which is usually our venue for the cocktail, is closed due to renovations, so we will be inside. And this just gives you a graphic representation, the map showing the proximity of the two buildings, and to point out that I used to rent the house immediately next door to this building when I was a student and lived there with 16 other students, so I'm used to having things conveniently located. The recordings are all archived on the Respiratory Effectiveness Group, so thank you very much, REG. REG, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a respiratory disease think tank based in Cambridge, UK. But all of this would not be possible without our industry partners. So thank you very much, industry, for your contributions. Making this happen is very much appreciated by everybody here, because to get to where we want to go in terms of improving patient care and having appropriate technologies deployed in the appropriate places, we need to work together. So the networking supper ahead of us tonight was enjoyed last year. Will be substantially more, because I think we have another 25% folks more based on last year. And as last year, Charlie's arriving late, but he's nonetheless welcome, and love the shirt.
I figured the shirt would get me a pass.
You got it. And you know what? The theme of the shirt's even better.
Yes.
And again, my gratitude has to be expressed, because I could not do this alone. I have support both of the university and the Meekins Christie Lab, and Jacqueline is outside doing the badges, but behind the scenes there's also Inga, Linda, and Maria, so thank you very much. Evelyn, who's shy and refuses a headshot, manages the monies for me at the RI accounting department. So thank you, Evelyn, and I hope you're enjoying your holidays currently. And finally, my students. So I think there's about 16 between the different years that have been with me. I have returning students from last year in the top row, and they're helping mentor the new students, who you see as the bottom 3 slides, and they span the gamut between undergrads and PhD candidates. And for the rest, they're sort of between, I think, Med 1 and Med 3, but I have a hard time keeping track because I've become an old man. So thank you very much, students. We do appreciate it, and we'll be calling on you during the seminar. So welcome to the seminar. Great program. Let's get to it. We have 24 presentations from 28 faculties, 71 institutions, and we span all the continents, but I'm working on Antarctica. And then finally, 43 universities and hospitals and 27 corporations. So the scope of participation is just fabulous. So with that, I'll start my talk. Hopefully I took only 5 minutes for this. So this actually was to be presented by Lai Ping, who's over in Western Australia. And sadly, he had a family emergency which precluded his presentation. So I'm pinch hitting for him, which means that if I don't do it well, too bad. But anyway, I've got a slide deck, and I think I can convey the message, because I actually was a participant in the study. And to our knowledge, this is the first Delphi study to attempt to provide some kind of guidance for the interpretation of oscillometry. Our level of success, I'll let you judge for yourself, but at least it's starting point. And I actually look at this study as a roadmap of what I think are the unmet needs and where I want to take oscillometry in the coming years. And we will certainly be welcoming your comments when we open up the discussion. So We wanted to aid the interpretation of oscillometry amongst clinicians, focusing on the adult patients with either asthma or COPD. We wish to have consensus statements of which oscillometry parameters should be routinely used in clinical practice and what their cutoffs might be. So you can see it's a almost impossible task in the current state of affairs, but nonetheless. So we got together 16 people who thought they were expert in using oscillometry, 3 rounds of Delphi questions, and we targeted clinicians who were doing at least 2 oscillometries per week in their practice. And they were identified from the literature and then snowballing recruitment, which I guess is scientists speak for word of mouth. But nonetheless, we had no problem finding people. So we started off with our diligence and did a literature search. I struck up the steering committee, which were listed previously, and then we initiated the process. We had a brainstorming round with 10 experts in total to finally arrive at the questions. We set the bar low. We put consensus at 70, not 75% agreement amongst the 60 of us. And we went through 3 rounds. The first round, we collected our demographics. Second round were the questions that did not reach consensus. And the third round, what was still contentious, was hashed over once again. Here's the flow of what we did. So we actually had 197 folks. We deemed 23 ineligible, and I don't know the details on that. We had 107 people who just ignored us. So we ended up with 67. We had 3 withdrawing from the study for various reasons. We had 4 were excluded from round 2 because they didn't respond to round 1. And so we were left with 60. So we had 59 did round 1, 56 round 2, and 58 round 3. So we had 55 people at the end of the day who participated in all 3 rounds. The demographics, how do we describe us? Well, we're predominantly male, roughly 2/3. We're mostly from Europe, at least half, and then we're equally distributed between, say, Australia, North America, and Asia. Experience, well, almost 3/4 of us have over a decade's worth of respirology practice behind us, and 2/3 of us had been using oscillometry for more than 5 years, with a median test volume of 10 per week. And the devices are still predominantly iOS at 73%, and the balance being a various FOT devices. The parameters that we focused on were not the 5 derived, but the 4. So the short list of our 5: frequency dependence of resistance, low frequency reactance, and the reactance area. And parameters were used and associated with cutoffs overall, but they did not differ between asthma and COPD patients. A little bit different than some of us do, because some of us will actually have thresholds slightly different, but nonetheless, this is how it went. I'm not going through all this, but this is just to give you a visual representation of the level of agreement of all kinds of questions that you could think we might generate, and we did. Here they all are. And I'm just going to be more focused on the major findings. So we arrived at consensus that oscillometry is clinically useful for measuring a bronchodilator response. Please note that, Hannah. And that was a high level of agreement at 88%. Hannah's one of my students working on bronchodilator response this summer. Assessing clinically meaningful changes in lung function between visits. Grading the severity of lung function impairments, again, over 80% on that one. And then Z scores can be used to define the severity of abnormal lung function. And we had 81% agreement there. And we ended up with a very standard scale of mild, moderate, and severe based on typical cutoffs for Z scores. Now, I'm an old guy and I'm a percent predicted kind of thinker. So the Z scores, I'm still wrapping my mind around, but I think a lot of you have become very facile with them because this is the way that we're supposed to be describing our normalized data, and I am in the process of adopting, so the confession from an old man. If we go through this list of recommendations that we made, we thought that Z scores should identify normal R5. The cutoff for an abnormal R5 is the 1.64. For the low frequency reactants, we said, of course, the -164. And Z scores to identify AX abnormality. And again, these cut off the same 1.64. So the rest of it is fairly similar in terms of the bronchodilator response. People like to follow the R5, and a change in the Z score of 1.4 was put forward and agreed upon. Percent change for R5 and I think this may have been the only percent change that made it into the consensus, was also thought appropriate to judge in R5. The use of change or percent change in the low frequency reactions is assessing also a significant bronchodilator response. And there was really good agreement, 91% for the use of percent change in the AX. And we'll come back to that later, I hope, in the discussion. And that's to assess the significant bronchodilator response as well. And then finally, what is a minimally important difference at the clinical level? And we had Z scores for low frequency reactants and also percent change in the reactants area were considered to be potentially minimally clinically important differences. So do we have some take-home messages? Well, we have a couple graphics coming up, which are the punchline, but frankly, these are not a whole lot different than what's already out in the literature, so I'm not sure how much it changes, but again, it's a point to start a discussion and go forward. So we're going to define both the low frequency resistance, frequency dependence of resistance, low frequency reactance in the AX as using Z scores. And what does it mean? Well, again, we're simplifying down. So obviously the engineers and the physicists and the physiologists may take issue with these statements, but nonetheless, we're saying the R5 reflects airways disease, even though we realize it's from the lips to the chest wall, that the low frequency reactance looks at possible small airways dysfunction, amongst other things. So we have that caveat, and similarly, the reactance area. R5 also had a consensus for the use of 150% was the arbitrary cutoff, and we had no consensus to support the use of absolute values. I was one of the skunks at the garden party because myself and I think Brian Lipworth and a few others like, and is based on empiric everyday practice, the absolute cutoffs. So we'll debate that. And we'll have more occasion to talk about that because I think Sandeep Salvi is going to be talking about that exact issue for the entirety of his talk tomorrow morning. So we'll have plenty of room to have our opinions expressed on it. Finally, the bronchodilator response. Both the low frequencies of reactance and resistance and the reactance area are commonly used. The bronchodilator response and reactance or resistance, we had 47% said it's one or the other. And we had 45% that said it should be both, kind of analogous to what we're talking about when we look at bronchodilator responses in spirometry. We also had a percent change as useful to identify it, and the percent change cutoffs did not achieve consensus, but the most commonly supported ones were as per the last technical standards. So we have a graphic which I think summarizes what's been previously published, 40% for the R5, 50% for the X5, and finally 80% for the AX. Again, I'm a dissenter, but I signed the document because we need to get this out and we need to get discussions. So what are these? Oh, these are just to give you a graphic representation of the bronchodilator response agreements. Again, the 70% is our threshold. There we go. And I think we're almost done. So defining a minimally clinically important difference between the visits. Again, all four parameters are commonly used. We had the R5 saying that there were equal level support for either the Z scores or the percentage change. For the X5, it was the Z scores that people were putting forward. And finally, for the AX, there was agreement over 3/4 that it was also a percent change from visit to visit. And these are the cutoffs that we had published, again, as a starting point of discussion. So we really do lack evidence for the minimally clinically important difference. There's only one published paper out there. I know Chung Wei, you use it. I also use it, but it doesn't say that it's the best way forward. So there's work to be done there. The implications for research, we have improved reference equations as per the GLI. We want to define the abnormal physiology and the bronchodilator response. I think longitudinally, the MCIDs are really key to define well for each of the parameters. And finally, we want the data to be anchored to a grading system of lung function severity. And then we can talk about how the oscillometry measurement can predict impairments and linking to clinical outcomes. So to conclude, the use of respiratory oscillometry, we advocated to assess abnormal lung function and specifically small airways dysfunction. to grade the severity of impairment of lung function, monitor the progression of disease over time, finally to assess the bronchodilator response. So our concluding slide is as follows. Abnormal oscillometry is defined based on Z scores for resistance or reactance. Bronchodilator response is based on a percentage change for resistance or reactance, and the commonest cutoff based on technical standards, but really no consensus, and we're still lacking consensus on what is the minimally clinically important difference. I think that's the last slide. Yeah. So future directions, as I alluded to how I look at the study, a roadmap to the future, I'm now tabulating the decades worth of oscillometry practice I have from my office, which represents 2/3. I have another 1/3 that I haven't even sort of organized yet from the 2 hospitals I'm at. But this is the kind of numbers that we're generating. So a data set like this can be used to help answer some of the questions here, and basically encouraging other people who already have existing data sets, and sort of somebody in the audience that has a huge one who's come over from Vienna to visit us, specifically from the lead study. They also have, similar mountains of data, order of magnitude bigger than this. So if we all roll up our sleeves and work together, I would think in the next 2, 3, 4 years, we could actually answer many of these questions. So with that, I'm going to stop the talk and put my moderator hat on and open the floor and those online to questions. So I'm listening. Charlie.
So earlier in the spring, David and I were participating in a pro-con debate about the usefulness of bronchodilator response, and we came to complete consensus that it's totally useless. I think it's pretty clear on that. And so my question, that's my comment. My question to you, Ron, since you use this all the time clinically, we were of course talking about spirometry, and you really find it that useful? I mean, oscillometry useful as a measure of bronchodilator response?
I will ask you to hold that question until ERS. In my office, I do only pre-bronchodilator. So I haven't looked, I don't have a feel for the bronchodilator response other than what I read, which is the same that you read. For the first time, I have Hannah, who I alluded to last year. She's focusing her summer on collecting the bronchodilator responses that were measured in the hospital. So that data is not even part of this database. And we've identified, I don't know, are you up to 40 or 50? Where are you at with that, Hannah?
42.
42 and counting. So we'll see how far we get. But we have oscillometry and spirometry pre and post bronchodilator. So I need to get a feel for that.
Well, Tobias is looking at it. Maybe we'll find something there.
Okay.
Do
you want to give us a spoiler alert? And
just looked at spirometry so far. Oscillometry was in there, but it's planned. So
okay. And what's your timeline?
Oh, hard to say.
Well, our timeline is for an October Canadian Thoracic Society meeting abstract presentation. So will we beat you to it, or do you think you're going to have something ready?
No pressure.
Bronchodilator challenge. Jason.
Question here that there's no medical value to knowing whether someone responds to bronchodilator. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Talk to the doctor.
How can that be?
Well, I'm not sure. That statement doesn't come from me, so we're going to let David defend himself.
There may be certain situations where it's helpful, Jason, but I think by and large correlates with asthma severity, asthma control. The study results are all over the place. Differentiating asthma and COPD, it doesn't do a good job doing that.
So there's a spoiler. He was on the pro and I was on the con.
Yeah.
So, but you still give people bronchodilators. So what are you looking for? They feel better?
They feel better.
I see.
Exactly right. You're
Yeah.
treating symptoms.
Okay.
Eric.
Yeah, but I think clinically, if someone has a large response and gets better, it does help affirm, a diagnosis. I'm not saying not to give it, but I think clinically it's.
And I think that's one of the situations. The first presentation, especially a younger person where you suspect asthma, if you see a bronchodilator response, I think you can probably make a pretty good clinical diagnosis and not move further with methacholine or other challenge. But other than that, I'm not sure how helpful it is.
Well, when I see bronchodilator responses where someone with an AX of 80, so this is a sick person, drop down to roughly 20, 25, that person feels better. But it's an, is this a one-off? How consistent is that is the question.
But you're gonna prescribe it for them anyway, right? So,
Yeah, it's not going to change what I do.
Yeah.
It just makes me feel better about what a good doctor I am.
But I just.
Jeff.
I want to make a comment on the usefulness of this study. I mean, in the field, we all disagree about what the cutoffs would be. At least this is the impression that there's more agreement than consensus, but instead, this review actually clarifies that there's actually more consensus than disagreement, which I think is very important and well done.
Well, thank you. I think it's important for us to realize as we, operate alone in our own practices that we are thinking similarly. I'm trying to think the origin of this maybe, I don't know whether it was in Milan where Bruce Thompson and I had a conversation. And David, I don't know if you were part of that. We sort of buttonholed each other and had talking about, we just don't share and we don't have the information out there. No one's going to adopt oscillometry in the absence of some sort of guidance from people who are using it. So we got to start sometime. Well, that was 2017, sometimes 2025. So this is the pace of change in clinical practice, which I guess fits with the past as well. So it's no surprise.
Ron?
Jason.
Ron, the people online can't hear the questions clearly, so when someone asks, can you just repeat the question?
Okay, thanks, Daniel. So we just speak louder, Jason.
Yeah, sure. A critical component of this is reference equations. You mentioned them very briefly, because there are several out there. There's Ken Berger in New York, and you was talking about something else. So what reference equations do you think people should use?
The unsatisfying answer is I do not know. The issue again is we have the heterogeneity of devices. So most of the sets are actually done with the iOS, which is a different stimulus than we're using in FOT. So how applicable are they? I don't know. I would argue that probably okay because performances of these devices are similar at low impedances where the normal people live. So it's probably not bad to do it that way, but the purists will say no. We have some FOT normative data that's coming out from Tobias's and Charlie's group, the lead study. That'll be helpful. I personally, in my practice, find Ken Berger's are the best fit. I had done the ones coming out of Ellie's paper, and they gave crazy results, predicted thousands. I then did the Schultz's for a while out of Germany, but Ken's gave me the most sensible ones, but even his were not perfect.
Well, he was based on iOS, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to operationalize this summer the lead study, which will be published in the very near future. It's not out yet.
It's accepted in ERJO.
Okay, so that'll be in the public domain very, very shortly. And when you read it, don't blame me for all these exponential predicted values. It's they had some powerful mathematicians, I think, behind it, but I am eager to deploy it. So thank you.
I'm not sure how ethnically different, diverse is the patient population. How do you have any thought on the influence or impact of race?
We're teaching that race is a social construct.
Yeah.
And so I would like to say none. However, that having been said, social economic background will likely impact. As Jeff will tell you, height is probably the best surrogate for what your oscillometry is going to look like. And the height we obtain, although we all have genes with potential, they're not all realized based on our upbringing. So I think that's going to be the bigger impact and not race.
Patrick from Rochester, New York. Did a discussion about ratios come up at all? Telemetry ratios?
No, and that's something I think Rory Chan does. Are you also doing that, normalizing for the R20?
I haven't, but
I haven't either.
Yeah.
It's something that I want to play with, but I don't have an intuitive feel for that. But I know that Rory does do it. Rory is actually online. Can the online people, Dan, can you see if the online people want to ask questions? Because I don't have any online stuff going on up here.
And there's a comment, someone posted a comment.
Okay, read it, please.
Meantime.
Read
Oh,
it.
you want me to read it?
Yeah, read it very loud.
Okay, so Jun Chun said, just to share, recently I have a patient that doesn't have a bronchodilator response based off the cutoff value, but there is a normalization of patient's frequency dependence of resistance on post bronchodilator oscillometry.
And that's coming from Singapore General Hospital. Sadly, I can't answer his question, but I'm glad to say, give him my regards.
There's also a hand raised.
Good, so
So I think you have
you
to.
see, oh geez,
Yeah.
let's see.
So Ron.
me.
Okay, who is it?
Errol Gayard from Leicester.
Oh, hi. So you're going to be giving us a talk shortly. Did you want to
I
make a
will.
comment now?
I want to make a comment now and just really to say that I hope over the next 2 weeks we're going to submit a systematic review that is exactly going to be looking at cutoffs for bronchodilator reversibility in studies that have been published. And we worked on this with a brilliant student, and I worked with Francine Ducharme on this. So that's coming. The tiny spoiler I can give is to say I suspect the King GG cutoffs will be a wee bit too high.
Good. That fits with my preconceptions and biases too. So I'm always happy to hear that. Okay, thanks for that comment, Errol. We'll be hearing from Errol shortly after Chung Wei's talk. In the interest of time, I think I'll cut the conversation off here and ask Chung Wei to come up to the podium and give her talk. And I'll see if I can get your slides going while we do that. This is the correct one. Let's go share. There you go. We see that on the screen, but we're not sharing the correct screen. So can you go to Zoom and share screen? How come I'm having trouble with this year?
Seeing this?
No, we're not, because I have my computer over there. Oh, here we go. Let's see. Oh, maybe, well, I'm gonna just.
It says you're sharing.
Yeah, I know. I'm just gonna go. You were sharing, so I want to stop radio sharing. Okay. Maybe this will release it. Here we go. Share and where are you?
Yeah.
Okay, we have that. And that's that. So people are seeing you. You're good to go here. And then we can get your presentation mode all set. And that should be good.
Terrific. Thank you very much, everyone. And, with that discussion about the bronchodilator response, I want to thank Ron for making a detour yesterday to pick up an emergency bronchodilator for me. And that's why I'm not coughing this morning. But I also want to take the opportunity to thank Ron for running a tremendous seminar. It is really a treat. And for me, I think I speak for a lot of people in the room that this is actually one of the highlights of our year. It's a treat to be here with like-minded people and with people who are much smarter than I am. So that's where the fun begins. What I'm going to do is maybe take things back one step further than the consensus statement. And primarily, this is really an interest of mine over the last couple of years to really find ways of getting respiratory oscillometry into the clinical realm. And just a couple of disclosures, but specifically related to this topic is that my experience in respiratory oscillometry comes from a single center experience where we use it for our clinical research. I don't use it for clinical practice, but we do about 10 oscillometry tests per day in our group. And we always do it paired with standard pulmonary function tests. So that is also where our experience comes from. And really, when I think about this, in order for us to get oscillometry into the clinical realm, we really need to educate the people who are going to be using it for patient care, and specifically to actually educate the MDs by, so that they can understand its utility in terms of being a clinical tool, but they also need to understand what the measurements really tell them and how to interpret it. And specifically, what I'm going to do today is talk about how we can sort of enhance the foundational knowledge of respiratory oscillometry, and then spend a bit of time sort of maybe following up a little bit on what Ron talked about is an approach to interpretation of oscillometry. And I became the division director at U of T three years ago. And I took the director's prerogative and asked very politely if I could have some time to teach oscillometry. And in our program, the fellows are given 2 one-month blocks in their first and second year. And I have been assigned a 30-minute lecture on it, but they don't have any experience in terms of interpretation of the oscillometry test. And so, when I thought about how I would do this, and Joyce Wu, who's here, and I have been doing a fair bit in terms of teaching. We've been asked, fortunately, to teach, pulmonary function technologists and also physicians in Canada and a couple of places elsewhere on how to interpret and how, oscillometry. And so we have a series, and I think some of you have heard this in terms of the basic principles of oscillation mechanics. And we go over a fair bit in terms of the guidelines for conduct and QA and QC standards. Because one of the things I've also heard throughout my sort of time of the last couple of years is that there's a lack of understanding that QA and QC are important. I have had people say to me that, oscillometry is great because it's really easy. The patients can do it lying down. They can do it, standing up. And it's great for lung transplant because it's useful in single lung transplant patients. And so a lot of our time is really trying to sort of focus on the fact that, like a blood test, like the blood sugar, it's a very useful test, but you have to do a fasting blood sugar if you want to actually make an accurate diagnosis of things. And in red, this is a project that is not exactly on the back burner, but it's a project I have in mind, is that I think we need the equivalent of the John West lectures, because I still refer my students to them. And there are a couple of people in the room that I, am targeting when I finally get, time and some support to do this. But really, it is I would very much love to have a series of lectures that are very clear, but and concise, so that we can actually use them as an ongoing basis for teaching. And then, and this is also open for discussion amongst the group, but we do need people to have hands-on experience in terms of collecting the data so that they understand where the data comes from and what they mean. And probably more importantly, to actually understand where artifacts, and so that we get away from this issue of, people can do it at any lung volume. And this summer, I started doing case series with my own group in conjunction with Ron and a few people who were interested in joining. And we have found them to be very useful. So, and this sort of gets me to the need to have a standardized report so that we can actually teach it in a meaningful way, so that regardless of which device, what company, whether you use FOT or iOS, that you actually can look at it and say, okay, I know where to start. And why do I say this? Is that when you look at the current outputs of the commercial devices, it is truly a smorgasbord of actually outputs. And maybe I'll just go back to this for a moment. I think it's really key that we have all the metrics that we're interested in one page, and we want to be able to see it at a glance. Most busy clinicians have no patience for actually flipping through pages, for turning their head upside down 90 degrees in order to understand what the outputs really mean. And so this is actually, we have two commercial devices in our group, and both of them FOT, but this is a Resmond device. And as you can see, it's 4 pages of output with a lot of white space in between. Many of you are oscillometry users. I don't know. So I'm going to leave it to you in terms of whether you think these things are helpful, and will help you at a glance and say, well, I think I know what the problem is. Here are a couple of other outputs, and I want to thank, give a shout out to my Singaporean colleagues who actually sent these to me less than 24 hours ago, because I don't have iOS devices. So here's one iOS output. And here are, this is another one here that you see here. And then this is the tremor output that you can see. And so I want to sort of think back to a scenario, like, just think about this. 100 years ago, what if we decided that it's okay, you can actually present your chest x-rays in any way, shape, or form that you want? And so, or a CT scan. So, this is probably what happened to Princess Margaret. As you know, she got the wrong lung taken out for her lung cancer. And do you think that our cardiology colleagues would say, it's okay, I'm going to buy this ECG machine and this is the output I'm going to get. The other ECG output is going to be flipped upside down, sideways, and on the side. That's unacceptable, right? So I don't know if we have any industry partners here, but please give us one standardized output so that we can actually talk to each other very accurately. And specifically, this is really a very personalized approach to this based on our experience. But I think that for me, like a spirogram, pattern recognition is actually key. And so this is how I start whenever I see an oscillometry. Well, don't look at them, don't look at time. But I look at this and I'm going to say that Ron gave me this idea of using musical instruments to this. And so in this green box here is a normal oscillogram. It looks like a flute. In the bottom two oscillograms outlined in the yellow, these are patients with obstructive defects. And they are horns. So they're a French horn, a blaring horn. And then the other pattern that we see is actually a restrictive pattern where the major difference is in the reactance curve. And I call that my clarinet. And why is this important? Because I think this is really a way for us to really start talking about how we would approach the interpretation of an oscillometry. And I got this idea from my colleagues in Singapore. This is the cheat sheet that they used, that they had developed on their own many years ago, and they have updated over the years. And so I've actually stolen this from them and actually interpreted, have developed our own. So this is my ideal of what a standardized oscillometry report looks like. I have we can quibble a little bit about which specific parameters you want to see, but the key thing is you start off by looking at the oscillogram, and you look at it at the very beginning and say, you know what an obstructive pattern looks like. So like, is this normal versus obstructive, or is it something else? Then, if you're really lucky, some of the, so this is what I'm really talking about. So you look at it and you say, okay, I have an idea already whether this is normal or not. Then you sort of say, if you're really lucky, you look at some of the different commercial outputs. Some of them will give you an idea of what the upper and the lower limit of normal is. So this is the Tremoflow, this is the Resmon, and then this is the iOS device. And I think this is there are what's outlined here in the. Oh, you're not seeing this. You're only seeing this. You're not seeing my pointer, are you?
Try again.
No. Okay, hang on.
So there's a pointer-
Someone
there's a
should.
pointer on the counter that you can actually point. to.
Okay, so you can see this now? No.
No.
Okay. Oh, now. Nope, that's not what I want.
Great place.
Here we go. We'll just go this way. So,
Uh-huh. Oh, I wish someone had told me.
there you go.
Okay.
Better late than never.
Okay, so I think in the iOS devices, they're telling us that this is the upper and lower limit normal, but you do note that they separate the graphs of the resistance and reactance into two separate graphs. So you have to, in your mind, figure out what that really looks like. But then really important, and I think we skip over this a lot, but you really need to look at the quality control. So you look at the waveforms, you look at what reference values were used, what the CV was, and you can see that that's available in some of the devices. And then very important is look at the technicians and their comments about whether or not it was an appropriate test. And then lastly, then we go to like, how do you actually interpret this beyond this? And I've come up with an idea of using a decision tree. And so what we do is we actually start off at the very beginning of looking at the reactants, looking at the reactants first. I personally prefer the AX to the X5, but I think that one could do that. And then you make a decision is that if the AX is normal, then you look at the resistance value, and if both of them are normal, they're normal. And what I haven't quite, and we'll just skip this for a minute, but if it's abnormal, then what I then do is I look at the frequency dependence of resistance. And if it's normal, so that means then if it's normal that there is actually no small airway obstruction, then these are like, and then you look at the R5, and usually the R5 is also normal. And if that's normal, then it's likely a restrictive defect. However, we have seen in many cases where we do see a normal R5 and an elevated R5, and that's of course associated with an increase in R5 to 90. We see that with some of our restrictive defects as well. And I haven't quite figured out where the underlying restriction is, because we have not seen a consistent response in our, parenchymal chest wall restriction. But then when the AX and is abnormal, the X5 is abnormal, and the R5 to 19 is abnormal, what you then have is an obstructive defect. You see this also with obesity. What you can't differentiate with oscillometry is mixed restrictive and obstructive patterns. And in our cohort, we have like gazillions of mixed obstructive restrictive defects because of the lung transplant population. And that is sort of our approach to this. You've noticed that I have not on purpose put in any cutoff values because I didn't know what they were. I was part of that Delphi study, and I'm going to echo Jeff's comment, because I didn't think that we would come to a consensus at all. And so I think that the community is probably more in agreement than in disagreement. And then the last thing I'm going to do, and I see that, Ron's standing here, but, I think that, at the end, I have interpreted for pay 2 oscillometry reports for insurance. But I think it's important that we actually have some sort of standard wording that we use to describe our findings. And I also want to sort of outline the fact that any pulmonary function test is just a diagnostic tool. It does not make a diagnosis of a disease. And so with that, I want to thank my group and the PFT lab at the Toronto General for their support.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You echo the sentiments of many of us in the audience. In the interest of time, I'm actually going to defer the discussion on this one and loop it in at the end. And we'll get to it before the coffee, but I know that Errol is online, and he's the next speaker. So I'm going to get Errol, in case there's time constraints over in the UK that he has to get going to give his talk. And then I think following Stephanie's talk, we'll then revisit the discussion and then just take it into coffee. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here, I hope, and introduce Errol, who's from the University of Leicester. And we met for the first time in London at the REG meeting, and I'll let him do the rest of his introductions. Are you sharing? Okay, good. So you're taking over successfully, and let me see if I can get you on the screen here.
Wonderful. And being in a French speaking place, I can even pronounce my surname correctly. So I'm Errol Gaillard. It's Swiss French. I'm working at the university and at the hospital in Leicester in UK. And thank you very much, Ron, for inviting me to speak at this fantastic conference. Would have loved to be in Montreal, but maybe another year. Anyway, Ron asked me to talk about oscillometry to assess ventilation heterogeneity during hospital admissions for acute cardiorespiratory illness. And I think he wants me to present a paper I was recently involved in with my adult colleagues over at Glenfield. You only missed my conflict slide, a few conflicts. I don't think any that majorly interfere with this particular talk. And this is the paper I will essentially be presenting, and it's been published in the ERJ Open in 2025, so just a few weeks ago. Right, so the study aims where that traditional forms of lung function measurements in patients hospitalized with acute respiratory illness, as we know, is difficult and actually is rarely done. So pediatrics or adults, when patients come in, they have an acute dyspnea, we don't normally test their lung function. And the reason is because it requires maximal effort. So the study aims here were to investigate whether it's feasible to do airway oscillometry in acutely unwell patients admitted to the adult hospital. And the diseases essentially COPD, asthma, pneumonia, and heart failure were tested. And we wanted to report differences in airway oscillometry between the acute illness, then recovery, and compare this to a group of healthy controls. So the study population was quite large, 310 participants. 263 of those were hospital admissions, and you can see the breakdown, healthy numbers of patients with asthma, COPD, heart failure, and pneumonia, and there were 47 healthy controls. So this study was really run during COVID times, and it was part of the UK Medical Research Council funded East Midlands Breathomics Pathology Node Study. This is a mouthful really, but essentially was a breathomics study to understand whether you can diagnose specific respiratory conditions, because sometimes there is confusion about somebody coming in with COPD or with heart failure, to see if breath would help to distinguish a patient group. And that data, in fact, has been published. And yes, there are distinctions that can be made, but obviously we're not here to talk about this today. Just to, we'll come on to this when we see the data, but the predicted value equations for this set of data was generated based on the 47 healthy controls. And essentially participants underwent handheld oscillometry within the first 24 hours of admission to hospital. We used the Tremorflow C100 and essentially captured R5, 19, R5 minus 19, X5 and AX. So data points you might expect to see. So this is the baseline characteristics, and so I just wanted to highlight a few things on there because that'll be important to put in context with the data. So starting with the age, so the asthmatic population was quite a bit younger than the other population, including the healthy controls, and that also belonged into the higher BMI group, which I think is interesting, heart failure being the other one, where patients were predominantly overweight. Moving on to oxygen saturations, if you scroll across the line, you can see that this was a relatively, I wouldn't say mild group, but you can see that the oxygen saturations were predominantly in the normal range, at least the mean or median here. So this wasn't a very severely ill group, and I think that's important to recognize. In red, the eosinophils, because that is maybe not unexpected. I mean, they had the highest eosinophils in the asthma group, but actually it wasn't strikingly high compared to, say, healthy controls or even the COPD. And the rest is just the BNP to show that the heart failure patients, as you might expect, had a very high BNP, and CRP, again, you might expect very high in the pneumonia group. This is just to say that patients were allocated to the right group, probably. And this is the summary oscillometry data by disease group. And the reason I've thrown this up here is because at a glance, you can see that the healthy on the left, that is the data, but across then asthma, COPD, pneumonia, and heart failure, you can see that for all the values, there was a significant difference to healthy controls. So all the disease groups had very different results compared to the healthy group. And now jumping into the details. So looking at R5 and R5 minus 19, so more global airway resistance and small airways disease. And in the graph on the left is the R5. All the data for the disease groups is measured against the healthy controls, and they're set at 100%, and all the groups are compared to that. And what jumps out is two things, and one is that the COPD group really seems to have the most abnormal results, certainly for global resistance, but also for small airways disease. And I thought interesting in here is the asthma group, because intuitively, personally, I would have thought if I, before the study results were out, that the asthma group would be a little higher than they were, but effectively from the disease groups, they were the lowest in peripheral airways resistance and also global airway resistance. So I thought that was interesting, and potential reasons for small airways disease, of course, a complex mucus plugging, airway closure, bronchoconstriction, the usual suspects here. What I found really interesting was the results for patients with heart failure, and doing a little bit of background reading. This is increasingly recognized as an important issue in heart failure, and it does contribute to exercise intolerance and also impacts long-term outcome. And it is thought to be caused by thickening of the small airway small airway walls, and also narrowing of the bronchioles, and worsening by the build-up of fluid during acute heart failure. So I thought that that was really interesting. So what about airway stiffness? And really for X5 and AX, similar results in COPD and asthma. Again, COPD having the greatest stiffness, and asthma relatively small compared to the other disease groups. And so we have the X5 on the left and the AX area under the resistance curve on the reactance curve, I should say, on the right. So what about resonance frequency? Again, resonance frequency is a good indicator of airflow limitation, and so really represents the other bits of results that I've already shown you. Highest in COPD, where it's also felt that the hyperinflation we're seeing contributes to the resonance frequency. But again, I would have probably expected to see this more in the asthma population, but we did not. So how do the results compare to how the patient feels? Because this is really important. Does it relate to symptoms? And this is the visual analog score that is completed by the patient. And it's the panel that on the top shows R5 minus 19, and at the bottom AX. And there is a breathlessness top left, which I think is completed by that would be the heart failure, the pneumonia, and the COPD patients. And a higher score indicates greater breathlessness. And I think there is a really nice correlation between the patient's feeling of breathlessness or wheeze, which is the right-hand panel for the asthmatic patients, and oscillometry parameters that essentially worsened the worse the patient felt. I think that is a really nice correlation. And this is just to show what this is. This is literally the patient on this score gives himself or herself a score 0 out of 10, where the 10's worst possible, the 0 no breathlessness, and so it is subjective. But actually, the data supports that the patient actually fairly accurately seems to judge themselves in the level of breathlessness. In our oxygen saturations, and again, I thought there was a really nice correlation between oxygen saturations and oscillometry parameters. So here, patients with very low saturations, less than 92, clearly had more peripheral airways disease, small airways disease, and patients with good saturations had much better value, and there was a really nice correlation. And in fact, the same was found when we looked on the reactants here. So really nice correlation with their need for supplemental oxygen. So this was the inpatient data, and we're now going to the data when patients have recovered. So clearly it's much more difficult to recall the patients once they're well. They don't necessarily want to come back to hospital. Some of them, COPD, probably have frequent admissions anyway. So, but we managed to convince 63 patients to reattend. And you can see some of the outliers make this graph slightly hard to see the median values, but there has been improvement in all oscillometric parameters from the acute setting to the recovered setting in all values tested. So we can say, yes, we can detect abnormality during hospitalization and then improvements when patients have recovered. I picked this out from the supplemental data because I thought it was quite interesting to look at individual patient data, and you can see that the pattern is somewhat mixed. So some of the asthmatics seem to improve after they recover, others, their oscillometric parameters are not so much. So it is a little bit of a mixed bag, but the trend definitely was towards improvement. The conclusions of that study is that oscillometry clearly was feasible in acutely breathless patients in hospital. And I should have said, it was probably somewhere on the slide, that all the patients tested produced a valid result. So I think that's in itself very impressive. Worse lung mechanics were seen in acute COPD, and worse lung mechanics were associated with increased breathlessness and wheeze and lower oxygen saturation. So really nice correlation with the objective clinical status, that is the oxygen saturations, and also the subjective feeling of the patient, how breathless or how wheezy they felt. And then parameters clearly improved after recovery from the acute illness. Now, the changes in both resistance and reactance were very similar across the different pathophysiologies. So this is something that we need to reflect on, because we cannot use oscillometry to diagnose a reason for acute breathlessness. And there may be a reason why every person, or why these people coming in with those conditions had abnormal oscillometry parameters, lung infiltrates, fluid on the lung, various aspects could contribute, but still there was relatively little difference between all four of the disease groups. So whilst we cannot use it to diagnose breathlessness, as far as we can tell, it could still be a very valuable tool to monitor the respiratory system independently in hospitalized patients, and I think that would be really useful. I skipped the next slides. It's a study that we've done on nasal mouth mask in children, and it would be useful also for hospitalized patients. But in the interest of time, I don't want to overrun in the meeting more. I would say thank you for listening, and I put up from the Copernicus European Space Station, I put this slide now always at every end of the presentation, just to highlight how hot the climate is getting and how we really need to be careful that climate change doesn't run out of control. Thank you for listening, and happy to take questions.
Errol, thank you very much. Your presentation was very, very much worth the wait. So I'm glad our technical issues were solved. Also, speaking of weights, I think it was in 2016 when I was visiting Salman in Leicester that I first heard about this study being done, when he said, I've got a C-100 parked at the Glenfield Hospital emergency room. So it's been 9 years I've been waiting for it. This is great to have this car test driven on the racing track that is, you know, real world clinical emergency room practice. And so, yes, we need to know the limitations of it. I would have liked to have seen some more discriminatory capacity, but this is the reality of the pathologies we're looking at. So the question is, okay, this is a limitation, but are there other niches? And so I wondered if we had patients who had presented with acute thromboembolic disease, how they might have looked compared to the other folks, preserving their lung mechanics for the most part, yet giving a score of tremendous breathlessness. So I throw that out as one comment, and then I'm going to open the floor to others.
That is a very good question. I don't think we had this patient population, or they were not intended to be studied. And therefore, I'm afraid I cannot give you any information on that, but it would definitely be very interesting to look further, to look for applications.
Folks in the room, Jason.
Yeah, very interesting talk. Thank you. You've got the word heterogeneity in the title of your talk. I think people usually take R5 minus R20 as an index of heterogeneity. So I have two questions. Heterogeneity of what? And how do you know?
I didn't get the first part of your question.
When you say heterogeneity, what the heterogeneity of what? What does that, what's heterogeneous?
Can you repeat it, Ron?
It's
Yeah, so his
homogeneous in
question
what sense?
pertains, Errol, to the title of your talk is Oscillometry to Assess Ventilatory Heterogeneity During Hospital Admission for Acute Cardiopulmonary Illness. And so Jason is saying, what ventilatory heterogeneity are you specifically referring to?
Yeah.
I'll let you take first stab since he's asking you before I answer on your behalf.
I'm being slightly provocative here because everybody uses this as heterogeneity, but I wonder how many, what does that mean? Well, I'm asking that question.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess what they, as a team, what we were trying to explore is really this built on maybe lung clearance index, and to say, okay, what do we know about gas mixing and you know, the ventilation heterogeneity that we would normally associate with the lung clearance index, i.e., how much trapped air can we expect in the airways? How difficult is it to clear? And I think many you know, comparisons are being made by lung clearance index, ventilation heterogeneity, and the value obtained R5 minus R20. And I think this is what this was alluding to.
Okay, so in that sense, if it's related to the LCI is thought to be a measure of parallel heterogeneity.
Can you hear that? Can you hear him
one
well,
region
Errol?
being different to another. So by analogy, then you're talking about parallel heterogeneity in the lung, like one lung having a different time constant to another, or different diffuse parallel airways having different time constants, which is one interpretation. But then you've got to ask, how does that tell you you have small airway disease? Because that heterogeneity can happen at the level of large airways.
So maybe for those type, you know, the ventilation heterogeneity, nowadays you can do hyperpolarized gas, you know, and that would be much better way to measure than, you know, using.
Right, but it's the same.
CI.
I won't go on. I'm going to talk a bit about this much, but I just wanted to see what people.
Okay, I mean, for better or for worse, I would say that, you know, the AX is reflective of mechanical heterogeneity of the respiratory system. And you're right, so we've linked that to the ventilatory inhomogeneities as measured by functional imaging.
Right.
So as a clinician, I tend to say, you know, I've got a point of care measure of ventilatory heterogeneity, even though I'm sort of glossing over the details a little bit because I'm measuring the mechanics, not necessarily the ventilation. Is that fly in your department? We have to walk the fine line between engineering accuracy of what we're saying and clinical understanding and application in the field. And we're always, this is the continuous trade-off in this field.
No, I'm not saying you should be precise. I'm just trying to say what is.
Okay, so I think that's pretty clear. And you know, my belief is that the ventilatory heterogeneity is what drives the respiratory symptoms of which the patients complain. Charlie.
How we see.
It seems to me that the setting of the emergency department would be a good place to look at inspiratory, expiratory resistance. And I wondered if you did that.
Errol, did you hear that Charlie saying the intra-breath?
Yeah, we did not do this, I'm afraid. This because the environment also is, of course, I think it's already pretty good that they managed to recruit this number of patients from a department that is extremely busy and patients that are, you know, partly, I mean, yeah, we said they weren't that sick, but actually they were sick enough to be admitted to hospital. So I think these delicate experiments will have to come after. This was really to set the scenes, understand what we were going to see, and now interpreting the data, and then move on to say what is the next more sophisticated, or not more sophisticated, but the next step where we should take this.
Having done studies in the hospital and in the ED, I appreciate the difficulty of doing this, and so congratulations.
Yeah, I echo that. A big congratulations. I think one more question, Chung Wei, and then we'll move on because we're only 5 minutes behind at this point.
There's a
We
question
are
in the
technically
Zoom.
catching up.
So just a very practical question. How many of the patients needed supplemental oxygen, and how were they split it? And if they did do them on the supplemental oxygen, how?
Were any of the patients, okay, you heard, sorry.
Yeah. I heard that. I'm afraid I haven't got the information at my fingertips, and unfortunately we didn't stratify, because that would have been really interesting to look at other objective severity parameters other than oxygen saturations. I guess you could say some of them will have been below 94 and they will have been given supplemental oxygen, but unfortunately we didn't go in the data to try and understand whether there were differences in patients with or without supplemental oxygen. So I'm sorry, I haven't got that data.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much. We'll circle back. Certainly, you're very provocative, and we'll be talking about the study, I'm sure, over lunch. Dan, is there one parting thought or comment?
There's one more question in the Zoom.
Okay, read it out.
Sorry, there's a question. No, someone raised their hand in the Zoom.
Oh, Juan Calderon.
Yeah, one.
Okay, you're on. You can unmute and talk.
Hello.
Okay, we're listening.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I have a question. There is any variability during the year, because this is really interesting. The last slide that you showed about the heat. The question is there a relationship between the heat and the obstruction reported in the oscillometry? There is one. Another one is in the case of obstructive lung disease. The presence of a small airway disease motivates you to prescribe or to indicate a particular type of bronchodilator, or just there is no information about the treatment chosen?
Well, yeah, that's two very good questions. About the climate change, I put this in tongue in cheek, but as you know, with the increasing heat waves we are experiencing increased levels of hospital admissions in patients with severe respiratory disease, particularly in COPD. So the two are tenuously, but they are linked. And the second part of your question is probably not, because I suspect the heart failure patients will have been treated with heart failure medication, diuretics, etc., and the infection patients with antibiotics. And so on. So at this point, the oscillometry probably didn't change the course of patient treatment, but I think this is where we need to get to. We need to get oscillometry into the clinical setting where we are making decisions based on these results, and I think that will get it more widely applied. So I think that's a very good question.
Yeah, Juan, I suspect that you were alluding to the small airways targeted with the ultrafine versus the non-ultrafine particles, and we'll be revisiting that conversation later in the seminar. So with that, we're going to move on. Thank you very much, Errol. Next, it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the podium Stephanie Alexandre, who's one of our RTs from Lakeshore, who now has another life, but she also was an early adopter because she started doing the initial oscillometries with Carol Artico at the Lakeshore General Hospital back in 2015 when we set it up. So let me get our slides going, and Stephanie, take it away, okay? Okay. There we go. And are we sharing the screen online? Can somebody look at the computer?
No.
No? Okay. How about now?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, pointer, note, and click through that.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be with you. I considered it as a privilege. I had the joy to discover oscillometry. I'm Stephanie, respiratory therapist, now MSL in primary care for AstraZeneca. How do I change this?
Here, scenario on here, we need this off, you know.
Okay.
flip it down.
Good. So currently, this is my work. I do have some project in quality improvement. And also, as Ron already said, I was working at the Lakeshore Hospital before many years. This is our objective for today. I hope everybody is hearing very well. So to present you some clinical situation that I was exposed to, I had a role as a COPD RT. We were having a COPD follow-up at the hospital, so I could have some experiences because we have decided to integrate the oscillometry in our daily practice, and we have seen some opportunities. So I am very happy to show. And I will attempt to answer a 2023 oscillometry question, Dr. Silpa. I don't know if she is online or somewhere, but she had asked question about the work of respiratory therapists. We're gonna try to come with some answers. All right. Okay. Okay, yeah. So I have 3 stories. We're gonna start with Mrs. C. Mrs. C was very short of breath. She was a 62 years old female, stage 4 lung cancer. And they had difficult time removing oxygen from her for her to go home. And they didn't know how to organize all that. So they decided to give her palliative oxygen when she will be going home. But the doctor had an idea. They asked me to come and see, but I was a COPD respiratory therapist. I don't see any COPD diagnosis here. So, well, okay. So I listened to the situation, decided to go and see the person. And then when I went, she was so short of breath. We could test the lungs. And I said to the doctor, do they agree that we try oscillometry? And did she agree? And we were working with, Dr. Ron is working still in Lakeshore Hospital. He had us a good protocol. So we know what to do, even if it's not around, we could know using the protocol and discussing with the doctors with the results. And I knew that if ever I engage myself with oscillometry with somebody, I will have backup. So I could, freely ask that we can do oscillometry. So this is what we did. And that made a difference in the life of that woman that would have been leaving the hospital with only palliative support. But on the top of that, they realized that she had obstruction here in her lungs, and they could adjust medication so she could have improvement in the way that she felt. And the COPD that was behind was discovered and treated. Second story, Mrs. B. Mrs. B, average COPD person coming, from time to time in the hospital. So we see here severe COPD. And this is the curve. This person, in order for them to perform that way, it is not easy for them to do so. Some come like that, and some came out of the lab like that. In the case of Mrs. B, she had a CAT score heavy, a direct score. It is one of the tools, standardized tool that I like to use, even though I don't show that to you today. Because, sometimes it's difficult to have the value. Some people just don't want to tell you whether it's number 4 or number 5 in the cough, whether when they go to the stairs, they have difficulty verbalizing the answer. And then when you have different kind of tools, formularies that you can use, standardize, it is very, very good. So in the case of Mrs. B, this is her CAT score. Everybody are very familiar with CAT score as a pro. And, you know, we could see the cough and then taking upstairs is difficult for her and all those things. So the score is 28 out of 40, which is high. And that correlates very well with the oscillometry result that she had. A is 109, which is very big. So oscillometry, as the previous lecture that we had, correlates better with the pros. It kind of giving patients a real say, you know, what they felt, you have numbers to assess that, to prove it. So it is wonderful for clinicians. And now Mrs. A, because oscillometry, as Dr. Ron says all the time to us, doesn't tell lies. So this woman, this is the reason why she come. Actually, what happened, I had to do a presentation for our college, and then I was running to try to catch Dr. Ron. He started very early, running after him, couldn't find him. So I decided to myself, okay, let's see what he did. So I went on the chart. Oh, I see the writing. So I check that file. I say, oh, okay, they're gonna call me very soon. I was there already. And I saw the results. Oh, already oscillometry was done. Nice. 96. So I already have an idea of what to expect from that woman. And then here is the cat. She said, these numbers, I said to myself, she is minimizing the symptom. She is in a denial mode. And her son was there. And then she had already in her mind that she should relocate. She should stop living by herself where she was. And then maybe she had the hope to go living with her son. I don't know. But she did everything she could to minimize as possible the symptoms she had. And so, but I saw the result of her oscillometry before. So I knew I had to go further with these kind of values with her. We did an ACOG. I see, okay, that person, okay, the disease is severe on her. We did the board index, which is great. You know, it's not something that is new. And then that woman, her BMI was very low, 15. She needs support. We didn't have any FEV1 to put in the BODE index, but I guess with our AX 96 is sufficient enough to know that person is number 3, and the MRC scale, and also the, well, if she had to walk, because she is very, very slow to everything she do. So BODE index for the clinician listening, if we could put these kind of values in our evaluation, it is good for managers to know, okay, how we can organize the fluidity, who are the person, the COPD patient that maybe we should attach in the very limited resources that we should attach a COPD case manager with. Because it is a prediction of hospitalization, the length of the stay, and the expenses in the system. So it's very great tool. And yes, we did the clinical frailty scale. I have a story about that, but I will tell you in the break if you ask me. And so the person has, the time comes when Mrs. A gets her leave. So I demonstrate her how to use her bronchodilators that she had, organize everything for the community follow-ups, CLSC, SRS study in Montreal. We have that, people that goes home to take care of the patients. When it is the expert, the specialized team, it is the CSSRD. If they are here, thank you for your great job. The follow-up was organized with the respirologist, and then palliative approach was suggested, you know, for that kind of person to cope with the disease. And what was interesting with her is that her son thought that they know already how to do the puffers, because they were just puff in the mouth. And when they see that the technique was demonstrated to her properly, and then the woman was surprised, oh, she breathed in, and then she was surprised of that. And then I knew that I want somebody, because, you know, adherence is a big problem that we have. And when the person sees that, okay, there's a way that I become better, so that's a good tool. So take home message, oscillometry doesn't tell lies. Oscillometry is a quality improvement great idea to initiate in our clinical places because we have a big problem with the awareness. We have a big problem to finding the cases. I myself was lucky to be in a position where I was not attached to treatment to be given regularly to patients. I was not the one to be called for a blue code, so I could select in the files because we had a protocol, select who is the patient I'm gonna see, and then see that patient, okay, let's propose an oscillometry because maybe that person need to have that kind of test. And I believe that a good way to help in this is to have people that are inside the services, the hospital, the clinic, that can have access and then screen their patients themselves and then select who is the right clientele to test. Because sometimes the doctor will think about that and then will ask the specialist to see. But sometimes they don't even think about that person and that symptom. Maybe it is what we do. It is what we need to do because we have the guidelines now, the COPD gold guidelines, CTS or in the gold that says we have to reduce exacerbation, we have to reduce mortality. These things that we have now to do, goals of the therapy. And because of oscillometry, we can go further in that. So oscillometry is a based COPD classification that correlates better with PROS as the CAT than spirometry-based gold. And then this is when we were doing a training in 2018 at the OPIC. This is the College of Respiratory Therapists in Quebec. And so a lot of people were trained to know how to do spirometry. And this is, well, the last one that we did because after the pandemic, we kind of didn't do it again. So that was the World COPD Day. And then we had booths, people could come like that. And then they do oscillometry, discover what it is. They do spirometry after that. And when the Dr. One was there, and then the oscillometry say, I see that in your small airways, some change. And then oscillometry, spirometry says, no, everything is fine. So oscillometry allowed us to start some prevention. We can say to somebody that is smoking, you see, now you're not having COPD according to the definition of the situation. But if you could change some of your lifestyle, maybe that won't happen to you. And so oscillometry is a good way for us to do prevention and then to teach people. And thank you for your your time. Thank you for listening. I don't know if there are questions.
Stephanie, thank you very much for that walk in your world, showing that oscillometry really brings a lot to the table, to the practice. I mean, this type of granular case presentation, I think, is very effective for convincing clinicians as much as the statistics are and the big studies. We have to do it in parallel. I also want to give a shout out to the respiratory therapists, not only at my hospital, but globally. I think we need to partner. And this is a decision I made when I introduced it from my office after 2014 to the hospital in 2015. I sought out the RTs to get their buy-in, invested in their training, and then gave them the autonomy to use the tool that you demonstrated very clearly in my eyes, how it is useful to your practice. And of course, I benefit from that because Stephanie has actually managed many of these patients that I would otherwise be consulted for. So my work is easy. But the big beneficiary, of course, is the patient who's now getting altered therapy based on this evaluation. So congratulations. I'm really proud of how you've done, and I continue to follow your parkour with great interest. So with that, I'll open up the floor. Who has a question or a comment for Stephanie? Jason?
Yeah, thanks. Very interesting. What's your impression about how easy it is to use patients? Do you have it? I mean, you have to support the cheeks and you have to get them to sit and breathe quietly. It sounds like easy enough. Is it? I mean, what's your impression?
For the Mrs. A story, the test was already done. And because that person is so slow moving and doing everything, so I questioned the respiratory therapist that was performing the oscillometry. And she said that the woman come with the wheelchair and then she sits, she did her test. I said, did you have to wait, sometime when after they performing the spirometry, we have to give them some chance to catch your breath back. No, she did the test, no problem, no cough, no issue. Reminds you that I used to work also at the asthma ped clinic, and 3 kids, 3 years old, they were able to perform their tests and then no issue. So same for the elderly, you give the time, you allow them to come, you position them properly, tell them what to do. I didn't put that picture in that study, but Ron had told me to try a track patient. I called Mohamed Oseko, help me. So we fixed everything, and then we had the patients performing, so it's pretty easy. But that question goes to also Dr. Silpa question. I don't know if you have other questions, otherwise I will show what question she had brought to us.
Charlie.
Yes.
Fantastic presentation, and I think you underscored the importance of talking to the patient, and what a wonderful setting for education of the patient in terms of what's going on. This is a question based on something I was writing for Chung Wei, one of her studies. Do the patients tell you when they come back, God, please don't have me do spirometry, I really hate it, because my chest hurts for 3 days afterward? I mean,
Of
that's
course.
my experience. They really don't like doing it.
Of course, yeah, of course. Even for the one that has Mrs. C that has the lung cancer, I said, okay, maybe give her one day when she can, when it's better for her, and then we're gonna test. But if it was only for spirometry, there's no way she would not be able to achieve that. And yes, it's very important to pay attention to patients. And then I believe in spirometry also, because it's a performance. It's important not to rush them and to let them catch their breath and be given the time that they need. Yeah.
And I'm seeing it in my office, I call it the spirometry or PFT rebellion.
Yeah.
By the time the FEV1 hits 40%, they know that I am equipped with the oscillometer and say, I'm not going back to the torture chamber. I want that. And they
Right.
point to the device that's
It's really
operating on my
bad
desk.
bronchial challenge. Low.
This is a question from Dr. Silpa, but maybe some of you may have the same question. What factors to consider to increase awareness of adoption of oscillometry testing into a respiratory therapy scope of work in the pulmonary function test lab? It's not, well, I have asked some of my colleagues, and when everything is well set, if the test is prescribed, it will be done. And if the test is aside doing all the other things, so it's gonna be difficult, but if it's organized within the schedule, usually that's good. The question also about getting a sense of how respiratory therapists feel adding oscillometry to their workload. Dr. Silva wasn't sure if it was something that will add increased workload without adequate resources. So that is for managers, is very important to allow a room for oscillometry also, room in the time zone. And how respiratory therapists in general have been receiving oscillometry fantastically. Usually they are very happy. They need to be trained though. So if everything is done well, they're gonna become happy. When I first discovered that, I was myself to telling me, I am a respiratory therapist for so many years. This tool exists. I didn't know how come. And then I got the training. Yes, you did invest, Ron, in us. Even come to the office showing us how to understand those things. And then you become very happy, and then you can be creative because you can think about patients that maybe nobody else would think about, and then test and then make a change in their life. So thank you very much.
Who else in the room is an RT? All the RTs, please stand up. Come on, stand up. Thank you guys for all you do for us.
If I can say now, Stephanie, it is your responsibility to spread the message and to enroll each and everyone.
So one last question before we hand the podium over to Larry.
So question to Stephanie and to everyone, if any experience doing oscillometry with exercise test. So with the CPAT, we do like spirometry, post test, any experience in terms of doing it, interpreting it?
For me, unfortunately, no, but that could be very interesting, definitely.
We don't do CPAP in our community hospital, but I know that Brian Ross at the main NUHC hospital here at McGill has plans to explore that in the future. It certainly would be very doable, not during, but pre and post.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
A very quick question. Thank you very much, Stephanie, for the presentation. I'm not an expert, so maybe my question is basic. Do we correct or do we is the oscillometry measurements influenced by the breathing patterns of patients? From a neurological point of view, do we overestimate maybe the values according to the breathing patterns?
You want to answer?
I was paying attention. You repeat the question. Do we overestimate the breathing patterns?
Do we correct for the breathing patterns of each person we test for?
What we would like to do is have them do their normal tidal breathing. So hopefully going down to FRC and not overinflating. So that's why you will watch the live tracing before pushing the button to acquire the data to ensure they're doing that, because you're right. If they're taking bigger than normal tidal breaths, they're going to be up where the mechanics are more stiff naturally, and we're going to have a false positive, if you will, or more stiff looking lung. So that is all calibrated, not calibrated, but looked at as part of the quality control during the acquisition. Once you've got the data, you can't really go back and compensate for it. But if you have multiple measures beyond 3, then you can select with them and reject the ones where the patient may have been nervous. But usually reassuring the patient and just allowing them a few seconds, 4 or 5 breaths before you start acquiring the data is all you need. And it really adds no time onto the workflow.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Larry, come on up. Yeah, I'll give it to me and I'll load it on while you introduce yourself.
So, hi, I'm Larry Lanz. I'm a pediatric respirologist, but I also work in adult lung transplant. I'm at the Montreal Children's Hospital, and I do a lot with cystic fibrosis. And I'm going to talk to you about some of the work we've been doing in cystic fibrosis and oscillometry, and where we're going to go next.
Do you see it on the computer? No,
No, not yet.
Okay.
So. Can we do it now? We're good? Okay, you're all set.
Great, thanks a lot. And oh, okay.
I'll click here and then should be down.
Yep. Okay. So cystic fibrosis, for those of you who don't know, is a multi-system disease. It's autosomal inherited. It's a rare disease. It's primarily in Caucasian populations, but it is seen around the world. We have about 4,300 patients in Canada. In the US, there's about 70,000. There's another 75,000 or so in Europe. And it's less common in Asia and Africa. But it's due to a mutation in a gene coding for cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator, or CFTR, which acts as a chloride channel on the surface epithelial cells, and it results in thickened mucus and results in sinus disease and pulmonary disease. It also affects pancreatic insufficiency because the pancreas is blocked, so there's malnutrition. And standard test that's used is a sweat test, because the sweat does depend on CFTR and it's abnormally salty. And now we use genetic testing, and throughout North America and most jurisdictions will have newborn screening. But there's been a wonderful evolution in that there are now drugs called cystic fibrosis transmembrane modulator therapy. The most recent one is elexacaftor, tezacaftor, ivacaftor, commercially known as Trikafta. What I'm showing here, this is the study where we showed that in those who have even one delta F, because you can have homozygous or heterozygous, there's a rapid rise in the forced expiratory volume in 1 second, the FEV1, that's maintained. And now ETIs have been approved for, now we're up to, there's about 173 mutations in Canada. I believe, yes, all are now approved for that. There's about 300 or so disease-causing mutations. So as long as you have one of the mutations that is responsive, you are eligible. And what we can see is ETI was introduced in Canada around 2019. You can see both in children and in adults, there is nice uptick in FEV1. So you can see that by 2023, 3/4 of children have an FEV1 above 90% in dark blue here. And close to a third of adults have also a really normal FEV1, which says that spirometry was losing its sensitivity to detect the disease progression. Up until now, we used FEV1 as the primary prognostic factor for mortality. But now with so many patients having lung function within normal, how do we detect the diseases going on? Having said that, what does represent mild disease? So mild or early disease is really characterized by mucus plugging and airway thickening. And you can see this on these scans where you can see the plugging, but you can also see that there's a nice response to, this was actually dual therapy, so not even the most potent, that there was a nice improvement. And you can also see this, the other major measurement that's been used is the lung clearance index. This is essentially a nitrogen washout. So you breathe in 100% oxygen and you look at how many lung turnovers. Obviously, if you have inhomogeneity, Jason, don't shoot me, inhomogeneity of gas distribution, it takes longer for the nitrogen to wash out, and so the value is higher. And so a reduction in the lung clearance index it indicates that there is more homogeneous gas distribution. Having said that, the problem with lung clearance index is the equipment is expensive. In CF, it's became fairly standardized for one device, the Ecomedics device, which is expensive. It is complicated to use. It's been mostly used for research. There's been very rigorous training and certification for technicians to use it. So it's not the easiest to do. And the test is long. The reason the test is long is a healthy subject might be somewhere is between 6 to 8 minutes. If you have more inhomogeneity, it's going to take longer. They want 3 reproducible tests, and you have to give at least the amount of time that the test took before you do the next test. So if the test took 8 minutes, okay, we're already talking 3/4 of an hour easily. Whereas oscillometry, the equipment is less expensive. It's not given away, but it's less expensive. It's relatively easy to use, and the test is quick. Generally, you can do something within a couple of minutes if you want to get prolonged testing. I won't go into this audience, but we all know that we look at resistance and the frequency dependence, and we look at reactance and the area under the reactance curve and the resonant frequency as well. So there's been a few studies looking at oscillometry and stuff. I will say the vast majority of studies have used the iOS device. It hasn't always been very sensitive when people have looked, let's say, pre-post exacerbations. And so people are scratching their heads, where could oscillometry fit in? Here's a couple of recent studies. This is actually one of the few studies that actually really looked individually just at the patients who had an FEV1 above 90% predicted. And you can see that practically all of them had an abnormally elevated lung clearance index. Now, for some reason, the only thing they really looked at least comparing the two, they said they were going to do correlation, but they didn't talk about the other ones, was the R5 to R20. And you can see that it really didn't correlate all that well. In another study that looked at a spectrum of disease of patients, again, relatively young children, with FEV1s overall in a normal range, but you can see that there were certainly those that are abnormal. You can see that the FEV1 and the lung clearance index did correlate, and similarly for the forced vital capacity. This is values using values that have been for healthy children in Mexico, and these were healthy children in Poland. So, but the same message shows up. So, we early on, it was interesting to hear the Delphi and said, what are the cutoffs? So, we'll come back to that later on, but can you possibly use oscillometry to say you're going to have a abnormal lung clearance index? Maybe we can forgo the lung clearance index, but that's yet to be solved. So what did we aim to do? We want to look at children in our clinic who had normal spirometry. We used the Tremorflow C100. We used Francine Ducharme's predictive values, which were luckily generated in Montreal. So it's a very similar population to what we see. And we used race neutral GLI for spirometry. And for this study, particularly picked out, we had 30 children who had a really supernormal FEV1. They were above 90% predicted. And most of them were on modulators. So actually 17 of them, so half of them actually had supernormal. Everything was above 90%. And we didn't see much of a signal in the R5 or the FRES. However, what we did see is in the AX that this seemed to be somewhat higher than predicted. And so when we actually looked and compared them to lower limit and upper limit of normal, we found that a small number 2 had abnormal X5, and 3 had abnormal FRES, and they're not the same. So we get five of our 30 patients. So there is the possibility that there might be a signal. At least it gives us an indication we should explore this further. At least I hope you're going to see that with me. So at this point, we have normal spirometry that some children still have abnormal values, certainly in the reactance score. I had hoped to produce intra-breath results today, but they're not quite ready. So to come. We do definitely want to compare it to lung clearance index. I think they could complement each other. Certainly oscillometry is an easier test to do. I think when we have cutoffs, they could be useful. And certainly want to do longitudinal comparisons, but I really want to tell you where we're going with this. So what we're now going to do, and this is Mohammed master's project, is we're going to look at our patients and compare oscillometry to lung clearance index. Now, there's been some advances in lung clearance index. The group in the UK are now introducing at the end of the lung clearance index, they're taking in a slow vital capacity and breathing it out. And what they're doing is opening up regions that didn't communicate very well while you were doing the tidal breathing of the lung clearance index. And as an example, you can see here are 2 patients with very similar FEV1s and very similar lung clearance indexes, but one had a lot of mucus plugging and one did not. And you can see when they took in this slow vital capacity, not that much more nitrogen came out. However, in the person with mucus plugging and they opened up stuff, well, all of a sudden they got a big change. So actually they found that when they added in this extra component, there was a improved correlation with mucus plugging. And then in a subsequent study, they've looked at, they did inspiratory, expiratory CT scans and looked at air trap, measured the air trapping. And it really actually, when you add in these extra measures, which you can calculate unventilated or underventilated regions. There's a good correlation, but actually it was quite sensitive and specific for detecting air trapping. And so we want to do this in a cross-sectional manner. We are also working on a protocol. I'm working with Julian Tan from University of Saskatoon, where we want to look longitudinally in both children and adults. There is a new version of the modulators that are coming out that is felt to likely be more effective. Certainly, when you look at cell and look at CFTR function, it is improved. The clinical study, when they switched from the current modulator to the new modulator, actually didn't see an FEV1 change because everyone was basically unplugged. If you recall, there was a big jump up in 2 weeks of the FEV1, and we really think that's probably due to mucus, a removal of mucus plugs. But we want to look at this and with this extended lung clearance index, and we'll probably also add in low-dose CT to look at mucus plugging. We had thought about doing functional MR. There's only about there's 4 centers in Canada who have functional MR, so it's not all that available. We talked about pre-full. Again, it's not that easy to set, which uses tidal breathing and uses proton MR, but not quite ready for prime time and introduction in wide number centers. So we'll probably just go for mucus plugging scores. And I'll stop there. Yeah.
Yeah, so when you try to test a new drug for CF, and that's like a auxiliary clearance, it's very hard because only few centers in the globe can do it, you know. Do you think the oscillometry can be a potential alternative, you know, against the auxiliary clearance?
Well,
MCC or
well, that's what I'm hoping, and you know, there's been a big push to do lung clearance, which like I said, secondly, my bias is if we can have a test that is readily available, that could be used across, you know, so you don't need major training and all this, that we could use oscillometry to detect changes in small airways function, or at least detect that things are changing, and likely representing mucus plugging. I mean, we haven't been a center that has been doing a low-dose CT, it's, you know, to avoid the radiation. Although the radiologists tell me it's same as background radiation in Halifax, of all places. That's what Grace always goes. It's like living in Halifax. So that is my hope, that we can establish oscillometry, and in particular, I think intra-breath oscillometry, and that could be used as a sensitive measure to prospectively follow patients.
Larry?
Yeah.
How baked into the field is the LCI? I mean, is it unassailable at this point? Everybody wants to do it.
Yeah, a lot of places want to do it, but
the reason I ask is because from a sort of an engineering point of view, got a lot not to be recommended about it, because you collect 8 minutes of data, and at the end of it, you take, which means you've ignored all the stuff that you just collected. There are ways of analyzing all of that data and getting some estimate of heterogeneity, and in fact, not going out until the LCI.
Yes,
and it's much more robust, much quicker. I wonder if there's any chance of
I think that needs to be looked at. It's Sylvia who's led that. You know what? Unfortunately, she put in too much math in her paper. Yeah, you know, but I agree. You got a wealth of data and you take a single point. That's sort of been adopted because it's sort of like, okay, what's simple and something somebody can grasp. So that's what's been used. It would take some convincing, and probably going back and looking at all this data has been collected and using it and showing that this, if it could be easily presented and calculated so that you could get out these numbers, then yes.
Yeah, I'll talk to you about it afterwards, because I have a method. Can't save you from the math, I'm afraid. might be much quicker. So we'll talk later.
Larry, the idea of the extended LCI is very interesting. Has anyone tried that with oscillometry? Do you know? In other words, now take a deep breath and let's see what happens to AX and R5, et cetera. You'd imagine they would also improve.
That's cool. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah,
have you?
yeah, the Australians have done it where they go all the way up to TLC, slowly come all the way down to RV. And they try and get this as a metric of bronchial extensibility. And they actually take the inverse of that to get a conductance value. And that was published in Frontiers in Physiology, I'm pretty sure. Anyway, I can send you the paper.
We're doing it then.
Well, but we're only looking for the closing aspect of X5 on the way down,
Well,
but we could be looking
We
at
could
other.
be doing all these
Yeah.
other things.
Yeah, no, it's a really, it's a good idea. And I think somebody needs to explore that in more detail.
One thing there was,
Yeah, just Eric Garshik from Boston, just a comment about the LCI. I mean, I think you made the point, it's very dependent on the equipment you use. And like we're doing it in adults, post-deployment veterans using the NDD ProLab, part of the FRC testing, and what's been cited as normal value is completely different. It's less like when you get reproducible FRCs per the criteria, you'll get different, widely different LCIs, even though you got an acceptable FRC number to use in your lung volume calculation. So, you know, I think it's just different. And perhaps I think the CF Center may be doing it quite differently, using different equipment that maybe what's out there for others to be using.
yeah, early on, there was some comparison with the NDD and for some, it was dropped. And now the US Foundation has really said there's only one device, the Ecomedics device. So
Yeah,
I'm not saying the NDD doesn't give out values. People were in the going way back, people felt there was some black boxes because some of the original LCI people were going in really looking breath by breath, and somebody took a little breath here and you want to remove that breath. When I spoke to the people who do this extended one, I said, what about those little extra breaths? I said, just ignore them. just take what comes out. So the purists are knocked off the NDD.
Okay, well, we compared it to oscillometry. We have a very, statistically significant association, but it's quite broad. I mean,
Right.
so it's not useful clinically.
Right.
The LCI, the way we're doing it, whereas oscillometry, I think, is.
Right. Thanks.
Thanks, Larry. Interesting to see something from the CF. One thing I wondered about is sort of spinning on what David and others here sort of touch upon, and that is lung volume history. And we know this from our experimental times with Nirav and Jason and others here in mice, that standardizing lung volume history when you do oscillometry is super critical. Otherwise, you're going to have a huge variability in your group of animals or patients or whatever. So I'm looking at this here and all the different things that these patients go through when they show up at your clinic. Have you thought about that? Do you control for volume history in some way, shape, or form? Or should we maybe for certain conditions actually try to recommend a certain procedure to sort of have a baseline?
Other than doing oscillometry or force spirometry, no, we haven't controlled for lung volume history.
Do you think it would be worthwhile? I mean,
I'm not
have
sure.
to hear other
I'm
people's
not
opinions
exactly
about it.
sure what you mean. You're supposed to tell an 8-year-old to do something.
No, but maybe not having them run around in the room before you do it. And
Well, they're usually,
standardized
no,
some
they're
ways to
usually,
sit down.
they're usually filled up on chips and other stuff from the coffee shop across the way. Anything the parents would give them, anything to keep them quiet.
I just want to point out a fundamental difference between oscillometry. We already know it. It takes a long time to do the lung clearance index, but that's an advantage. It's looking at longer time constants of what's happening in the lung. Oscillometry, faster one. If we start at 5 hertz and go above, 1/5, it's much smaller than minutes in terms of the lung clearance index. So if the disease is presenting itself best at long time constants, lung clearance index would be actually something to do. It's better if you shorten the experiment for technical reasons and get a look at it And technically, that's what we're looking at. When we look at R5 minus 19, we're looking at the tail of something that's going up and up and up down into lower frequencies. Much more visible if we were able to move to lower frequencies. So there is a place potentially for things that take a long time, even though they're hard, annoying, and all the rest of it. There could be a place for those.
But actually, related to Leonard's comment about volume history, if you have something that takes 8 minutes, you can get significant changes, particularly in de-recruitment during 8 minutes. So if you have someone take a big breath for whatever reason, you may be having some ongoing process going on while you're doing the washout. Just something to think about.
Yeah, I mean, they are watching the screen. They're often watching a video that hopefully isn't too exciting. So, and they're encouraged to breathe. It's hard. I mean, it's very hard to breathe 8 minutes in a very standard.
You're also confounding things potentially because the volume history going up to TLC, some people will cause bronchoconstriction, others bronchodilation. It's variable. So one of the advantages I like to say about oscillometry, it doesn't change what you measure, which spirometry does. I've done oscillometry before and after spirometry in my patients. A third of the time there's a major change in the oscillometry result as a result. So you're changing what you're measuring by using the spirometry tool. So I would advocate that probably not going up to TLC is the way to go with these patients and look at them in their natural state of where they're breathing.
I have a question about the LCI. So the LCI, I believe that depend on the gas, the response will be slightly different, right? You know, the nitrogen versus helium, or is supposed to do the same?
It's done with nitrogen. So the original were developed with using SF6, but SF6 is a greenhouse gas. So basically but the results, if you compare SF6 to nitrogen, they're different. So yes, depending on which gas you use.
So then which gas is supposed to use? Because different studies, you know, I see that use the different gases. Or based on the instrument as well, you know.
Yeah, Stanley people are just using, oxygen and doing a nitrogen washout, as opposed to, equal. So that's what really everyone's using now. And so I know some of the newer standard PFT equipment also can do lung clearance index. And I've asked, yeah. And so have you compared it? And it's sort of radio silence. So I'm not sure. Okay.
All right, Charlie. So at the risk of inducing a collective eye roll, I'm old enough to remember all the time when people were looking at nitrogen washout as the early detection of small airways disease done back in the 70s. But it was abandoned. And it was abandoned because of everything you've just told. It's very unreproducible. Well, maybe that's the signal we should be interested in, particularly in CF where things are plugging, unplugging, closing. I don't think. So but the time frame is a toughie. Because of the long time frame it takes to actually, but it does not reproduce at all well after all the conniptions that people went through for about 10 years.
Yeah, and I've seen some functional imaging on with primary ciliary dyskinesia, but again, to pre-post physio, and it changes it, yes, but this area that was closed is now open. This area that was open is now closed.
Yeah,
it's a mess. The percent, if you look, you plug in that percent unventilated, it might stay the same, but it's the same area.
To me, that's the noise.
Yeah, but lovely to get imaging, but to come.
So remember, Larry, you're the moderator.
Yes.
And you're responsible for what time we eat.
Right. So we are going to stop there. And now you're going to tell me how to get the next speaker online.
You know what happened last time? We got a copy.
Right. But I will introduce, hopefully he's going to be joining us, Javier Palestina from Mexico, who's going to be talking about environmental aspects in children growing up in somewhat of a dusty and precarious environment.
Okay, I think Javier, yeah, good. We're seeing your slide deck. If you could go into presentation mode, you should be good to go. Fingers crossed. Okay, and turn on your camera so we can see you, because we just have Errol still hanging out in Leicester, and we'd like to go down to Mexico, please.
Ah, perfect. Great, thank you.
So, and introduce yourself, by the way. Welcome to Montreal. We wish you were here in person. Where are you and what do you do?
Hello, good morning, everybody. My name is Javier Palestina Ramirez. I'm from Mexico. I'm working at the Instituto Nacional de Enfermedades Respiratorias, the National Institute of Respiratory Diseases here in Mexico, and I'm making my medical specialty in pulmonary medicine.
Well, welcome. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning. It's a great honor to be with you today. And my name is Javier Palestina, and I'm going to present our project titled The Price of Living Precariously Incipient Small Airway Dysfunction in Infants from Big Years. Can you see the... Okay.
Yes, we can.
Yes, this is going to be our content. As an introduction, we have that air pollution is one of the main types of environmental pollution. Since Industrial Revolution, the air pollution levels have been rising, especially in developing countries. The emissions that are involved include some particulate materials smaller than 2.5 and 10 micrometers, known as PM2.5 and PM10, and some gases like carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and so on. The air pollution is responsible for more than 3 million deaths per year worldwide. And although it is associated with many diseases, the most affected system is the respiratory system. The World Health Organization has published recommendations regarding safe levels specifically of PM2.5. And according to the World Air Quality Report from the last 4 years, the countries with highest levels of air pollution are Chad, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Congo, and India. All of them exceeds by over 10 times the WHO recommendations. Mexico, my country, ranks the 55th with levels 3 to 5 times above the safe limit. And Canada ranks the 119, exceeding by just 1 to 2 times. That's very well. And why is this important? Because the implications in the lung lies in the physical characteristics of gases and particulate materials. The size allow them to reach the distal regions of the lung, especially the small airways. There they trigger inflammation and in early stages may be reversible, but with chronic exposure, the cycle of injury and repair leads to airway remodeling and even fibrosis. Actually, the latest GOLD report introduces the concept of early COPD, talking about chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which includes the biological and structural changes that occur before symptoms or detectable changes in spirometry, particularly involving the small airways. Traditional tests like spirometry may appear normal in these early stages, and the impulse oscillometry, the IOS, can reveal early mechanical alterations. It's important to mention about the lung development. We know that there is a prenatal phase of the lung development, but after birth, the FEP1 is increasing. We have the growth phase that starts from the birth and finished from 20 to 25 years at the starting of the adulthood. At this point, we have a plateau phase with a little variations of the FEP1 and then the normal declining phase. So this is the normal trajectory when we have the growth phase followed by the plateau phase and the decline phase. Okay, but however, insults principally during the growth phase, such as exposition to air pollution, may prevent the lungs from reaching their full functional capacity. This leads to altered trajectories in the lung function. And that's why the childhood is a vulnerable period with lifelong consequences. When an insult exists, we can go two ways. That could be now obtain the peak of pulmonary function or an accelerated declining phase. So here in Mexico exist the brickyards that are the spaces intended for molding on baking clay. They use fuels like tires, like plastics, like electronic waste, with the emissions of principally PM2.5 and the other particulate and gases that we have mentioned. In Mexico has hovered at 9 and 200 active brickyards, and chronic exposure to their emissions may pose a long-term respiratory risk. Our project consists, we have the objective to evaluate respiratory mechanics using impulse oscillometry in children either with acute and chronic exposure to air pollution. We conduct an observational cross-sectional case control study with 3 groups. The first group without exposure, we tested made it at our hospital, the Instituto Nacional de Enfermedades Respiratorias, acutely exposed children that living near the Popocatépetl volcano during its alert in 2023. And the chronic exposure, the children living near an active brickyard in San Luis Potosí for at least 1 year. We use the Therasis Thermoflow C100 device. We perform oscillometry pre and post bronchodilator using salbutamol 400 micrograms. The data interpretation was based on the Charms equations, and the statistical analysis was done by Kruskal-Wallis, followed by Dunn's post-hoc test corrected by Bonferroni. We included infants aged 6 to 12 years and with no respiratory illness, and those unable to complete the questionnaire or the maneuvers were excluded. In our results, our sample included 69 participants, 25 from the non-exposed group, 14 for the acutely exposed group, and 30 in the chronically exposed group. To survey the disturbances in iOS were only observed in the chronically exposed group. In this board, I show you this board summarizes the impulse oscillometry parameters across the 3 groups. We performed the Kruskal-Wallis test, followed by Dunn's post-hoc analysis corrected by Bonferroni to compare the group pairwise. And there were several statistical significant differences, especially between the brickyards group and healthy group. In these graphs, this box plot, I show you the resistance 5 hertz. We can clearly observe that the group, the brickyards group, has higher median and wider distribution of R5 values compared to healthy and compared to volcano groups. And similar results were observed in the post-bronchodilator maneuver. And with the post-hoc analysis, we had the P of 0.02 between when we compare the brickyards group versus the healthy group. Another results were the reactants. This second graph shows the X5 values, the reactants at 5 hertz. And here we observe that the chronic exposed group has also lower X5 values before and after the bronchodilator compared to other groups. So these results suggest that the group with chronic exposure has increased levels in resistance at 5 hertz and more negative results in reactants either at 5 hertz. And these early structural changes suggest that no response is not responding to bronchodilator administration. Our conclusions were that children with chronic exposure to bronchial emissions showed signs of increased airway resistance and reduced reactants, indicating incipient small airway dysfunction. And these changes may go undetected by conventional tests like spirometry, but the iOS offers a useful tool for identifying early respiratory alterations before symptoms arise. And then living near these brickyards may have long-term effects on lung, especially on lung function, especially when exposure begins during these critical phases of growth. And we start following the patients that have alterations, and we are planning to perform new impulse oscillometry maneuvers and spirometry with bronchodilator and follow them in the long term to discover principally their lung function trajectory. My special thanks to Dr. Laura Gochicoa Rangel and Dr. Rosaura Benitez Perez, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, well, thank you, Javier. We'll open up for discussion and questions. Speak loud so that Javier can hear. Dave.
Javier, this is David Kaminsky. Thank you very much. Do you have data on air sampling from the two exposed groups? I'm just curious about PM 2.5, and in particular, what's the volcanic ash composed of? Thank you.
We don't have the specific level of the PM 2.5 that day during the volcanic alert ash, but we can obtain it. And the volcano is the volcano ash is associated, yes, with PM 2.5 and PM 10, principally over the gases that the brick kilns could be emission.
Javier, really interesting study. Did you do spirometry in these kids who had been in the exposed to the brickyard? Gases?
So did you also do spirometry, especially on your brickyard children?
No, we haven't. We only perform impulse oscillometry, but we are planning in a few months to perform an spirometry pre and post bronchodilator, specifically in the patients with altered results. But we are going to do.
And in the brickyard exposed kids, what was the resistance at high frequency, 19, 20 hertz?
So do you have the resistances at high frequency like R19, R20 in the brickyard population? Were they elevated?
Well, the resistance only showed results statistically significantly at 5 hertz. We have the other meditions on another frequencies, but only at 5 hertz were a little elevated. When we compare these results to the upper normal limits from every patient, that was just some little increased.
Yeah, there was not an amount of increase very significant from the upper limit of normal, but the difference between the brickyard exposure to the volcanic ashes and the normal subjects, it was statistically significant. But in terms of upper limit of normal, both the three groups are between the normal limits.
Because to me, the results suggest that there's a response on the really large conductive airways because you're not seeing a change in reactance, but you're seeing the change in resistance. And there's sort of a parallel shift of the resistance frequency curve.
Larry, Sandeep is on, and given that he's one of the people behind biomass, we should probably bring him into the conversation.
Okay.
Can I ask a question, please?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So this is Sandeep Salvi from India.
Yeah. Can you open your camera, Sandeep?
Oh, sure. Okay.
Very cool.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Hey.
Thank you. What a brilliant presentation on a very important topic. What surprised me was the volcanic ash group. They were quite different from the the brickyard exposed work. But what I saw in your data was if you look at the height differences between the two groups, the volcanic ash group had a height about 10 centimeters more than the brickyard. So probably the lower values in the volcanic ash exposed group is purely explained by the height difference, because we know that in children the resistance values reduces with height as the height increases, as the age increases. So I think probably that could be a reason why the volcanic ash behaves so differently. And I'm so happy that you presented the absolute values rather than the percentage predicted values, because that gives us a very important piece of information.
I will buy you a beer at ERS.
Great. Leonard, did you have a question still?
I was
Yes.
even, well, part of the things that's been discussed already, but one thing that Salvi bring up here is that kids are growing, right? So that's one occasion we can't really just look at absolute values only. So I think it would be very valuable to have such scores presented and the contrast.
Right, and they used Ducharme's.
They
score.
did, yeah.
Yes.
So I think that is the value of it.
Yes.
It takes care of the height difference.
Absolutely. Children growing up in polluted environments might have growth problems and might end up being small. It's not like they just got exposed that last year. They've probably been exposed.
Yeah.
since-
And also they might have been under different nutrition status or whatnot. Yeah.
Right.
Very different areas.
Let's put a question back to Sandeep. In his biomass exposed cohort, which is well characterized over the years, does he see height disparities that are related to the exposure they had at mother's side in a hut with unventilated cooking fires?
So Ron, thank you for that point. We did do a comparative study in India comparing biomass smoke COPD versus tobacco smoke COPD versus the healthy population. And the biomass smoke exposed COPD behave exactly the same as the tobacco smoke COPD in terms of oscillometry indices. But there are some differences. The biomass smoke showed greater small airways obstruction compared to the tobacco smoke exposed. So the R5 minus R19 was bigger in the biomass smoke exposed population than the tobacco smoke exposed population. So that is the only difference. But they behave exactly more or less similar to what happens in tobacco smoke COPD in terms of oscillometry indices.
But are there height?
So do you have,
This study was in children, Dr. Sobel?
No, this was done in adults. Sorry, this was done in adults. I should have said that. Not in
Okay.
children. We have not done biomass smoke exposed study in children.
Okay.
Only in adults. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so thank you, Evie, and thank you, Dr. Benitez, for joining us as well. And now we're going to move on to our next speaker with technical assistance from Ron. So our next speaker is Yvonne Ho from the University of Colorado. So all you naysayers, who cares about bronchodilators? Well, in pediatrics, we care about bronchodilators.
Unmute yourself, Yvonne.
And she has to share her.
Yeah, she's got it. If you look behind you, we got it. Yeah,
No.
good there.
Where do we see her?
Green.
Oh, perfect.
Up.
We see it. We see it.
And you can all hear me okay?
Yeah, that works. So, yeah, so take it away.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. My name is Yvonne Ho. I'm a second-year allergy immunology fellow at the University of Colorado National Jewish in Denver. And so happy and excited to join today. The talks have been great, and I'm hoping to learn more and get some input on how other things or directions we can take with our project. So I'm working with Drs. Kovar and Dr. Binovich on the use of iOS in evaluating our pediatric patients for asthma. And so I think similar to the talks this morning, we were questioning about the criteria for bronchodilator reversibility. My outline. And so most of the time in pediatric patients, our diagnosis of asthma is clinical. Oftentimes, they're not old enough to do the other tests that we often order in the evaluation. So, sometimes we talk about asthma predictive index. So for patients who are young, if they meet either one major criteria or two minor criteria, we suspect there's a high probability of them developing asthma. But by the time that either PCP refers them to us for additional evaluation, or if there's a question about diagnosis, we'll often want to order more objective testing. And so in that, we look for pretty much three components in those tests. So is there evidence of airway obstruction or airway resistance on iOS, so seen on spirometry? Is there bronchodilator reversibility when given albuterol in PFTs for exercise challenge, and or do they have bronchial hyperresponsiveness in methacholine challenge? And so there have been, I think, we talked a lot about small airway dysfunction this morning. The Atlantis study, the prospective cohort study in adults with asthma showed that small airway dysfunction is prevalent across all severities of asthma, and especially in more severe asthma. And then their post hoc analysis showed that small airway dysfunction was associated with clinically relevant outcomes that we often talk about in our clinic visits. So has their asthma progressed so much that it's affecting their lung function? Are they having asthma exacerbations? How is their asthma symptom control? And then in addition to the benefits of spirometry in our pediatric patients, in terms of easier access and ability to cooperate with the testing, spirometry, iOS has been shown to better detect small airway dysfunction in spirometry. And so at our institution, in the past, we had previously used the left-hand side for our iOS interpretation. So I think several other studies have looked at particular cutoff values for AX and R5 minus R20 in certain age groups. And then we looked at the Camero study from 2012, and this is what we were using for our threshold for significant bronchodilator response. So a decrease in AX by at least 30% or a decrease in R5 by at least 15% after albuterol. And then the European Respiratory Society guidelines came out in 2020, which recommended the use of Z-scores for assessing obstruction or resistance. So now rather than just looking at these percentages or integers, we are looking at how they compare to the healthy population. And then what was really relevant to our clinical question was those guidelines recommended an increased threshold for detecting bronchodilator response. So change in AX of at least 80% and a change in R5 at least 40%. And then these, I think we know, were based off of the 95th percentile values in the healthy population or patients who don't have asthma. And so there have been several validation studies in the literature, both in peds and adult patients with asthma, showing that these guidelines did have pretty good specificity, but at the cost of sensitivity. And then there have been some other studies suggesting the use of lower thresholds with pretty good accuracy and sensitivity, but lower specificity. And then there's still a lot of other studies going on or systematic reviews of bronchodilator reversibility thresholds in children and what values we should use. So for us in practice, we were observing that pretty routinely our pediatric patients did not meet criteria for bronchodilator reversibility when you use the right-hand side or based on the new guidelines. But if you use the cutoff values proposed in the past, or if they happen to get other testing, such as methacholine challenge with auscultation or an exercise challenge, they did meet criteria. And them not meeting criteria based on the newer guidelines did not correlate with our clinical suspicion of asthma. So to start, we had actually looked at a previous study. So this cohort of patients was from a study of pediatric patients with physician-diagnosed asthma who did iOS in 2013 to 2017. This was about 40 patients, ages 2 to 16 years old, and 2/3 of them did have other testing consistent with asthma, so showing both obstruction and bronchodilator reversibility. It most often was detected on methacholine auscultation and spirometry pre and post albuterol. And so with this previous data, we looked at the parameters that were relevant to our question. So their baseline AX and change in AX, their baseline R5 and R5 minus R20 and Z-scores. And so when we looked at this initial cohort, we noticed that their baseline AX, so this is the median and mean Z-score, but it seems like patients with asthma in this cohort had baseline AX well within the range of values associated with the healthy population. But when you look at their R5 minus R20, and then the percentage of that for the R5 Z-scores, they did have, they tended to have higher Z-scores. And so we suspect that their baseline resistance in the small airways were elevated. And so these two parameters may be better distinguishers of patients with asthma than in those who do not. And so when we looked at the different age groups, so on the left-hand side is the percentage of the patients in this cohort aged 2 to 7 years old who we would say met criteria for airway resistance and bronchodilator reversibility. And then we took those same patients and asked, do they still meet criteria when you use the Z-scores or the increased threshold for bronchodilator reversibility? You can see that the percentage of patients that we would say met criteria had decreased. And then when we looked at patients ages 17 to 16 years old, I think ideally we would have divided into adults, adolescents and adults, but our sample size was small. It followed the same trend. The same cohort patients meeting criteria decreased when you use the new guidelines. I think we noted that with the younger patients, it seemed like the use of Z-scores was a better detector distinguisher, given that they did not drop as much when using the new criteria as compared to the older patients. And we've hypothesized that perhaps younger children are more likely to have small airway dysfunction than the older children who are more likely to have large airway asthma. And then when we combine this cohort and just all their ages, again, going back to our original clinical question, how many of these patients met criteria for bronchodilator reversibility with the previous cutoff value of a change in AX of 30% or more, and then how many of them would have met it if you increase that threshold to 80%, significantly dropped from 58% to 6%. And so when we look at the percent change in AX, in this cohort at least, the mean and median were quite similar, being a change of around 35%. And then when you look at the 95th and 99th confidence intervals, we're seeing that perhaps using the change in AX of 80% or more may be missing 99% of our asthma patients in terms of bronchodilator reversibility. And so we're suggesting that perhaps using thresholds based on 95th percentile response in the healthy population as proposed by the new guidelines may be too high. And so that's our preliminary data that we wanted to present so far. My fellowship project that we're working on right now will be doing another chart review, but on all pediatric patients who had iOS done at National Jewish, and this is expected to be about 300 patients. And so we wanted to do kind of a similar analysis, seeing, looking at the presence of peripheral airway resistance or small airway dysfunction and bronchodilator reversibility on iOS, as well as perhaps branching out into other clinical questions, such as whether iOS parameters could be correlated with the relevant asthma outcomes that we're interested in. So symptom burden, asthma exacerbations, type of an asthma controller used. And so essentially, we'll do the similar analysis looking at whether this new cohort of patients will meet criteria for elevated airway resistance and bronchodilator reversibility, comparing between the new criteria and old cutoff values. But then we kind of want to validate that and see, would they meet other measures of asthma, being either a positive asthma predictive index, positive methylcholinergic exercise challenge, or are their spirometry PFTs consistent with asthma? We want to evaluate the correlation between these parameters and those outlined clinical outcomes of interest. And then hopefully, because we're going to include patients with and without asthma, we can look into diagnostic accuracy of certain cutoff values or certain tests or combination of tests in terms of detecting peripheral area resistance and bronchodilator riskability. So doing sensitivity, specificity, and receiver operating curve analyses. And so hopefully we'll get a lot of good data and results from this project. And we're hoping to add to the literature on recommended cutoff values and to clarify potential diagnostic accuracies of iOS, whether iOS alone or perhaps iOS with another test can help cinch our clinical diagnosis of asthma. And I think for us, as we proceed with this project, we want to consider, how is this going to be useful for us? How should we balance the sensitivity and specificity of our asthma testing when evaluating patients? As said before, it's not the testing that makes a diagnosis. It's, our clinical suspicion, and hopefully our testing will support that. But I think for us, when we order iOS in these patients, it's most often because they cannot do spirometry or other testing, or there is uncertainty about their diagnosis. So I think we have to consider, do we want iOS in that certain circumstance to be more sensitive or specific? And that might change with the type of patient that we're evaluating. And so I think, again, hopefully we'll have good data to report from this study. I'm excited to see what it will show. It seems like there is a growing role from iOS in terms of its use in bronchial challenge testing. So those diagnostic thresholds also remain to be confirmed. With us looking at clinical outcomes of interest, hopefully we'll get more input on the role of iOS in longitudinal monitoring of lung function and asthma control and treatment response. So I think I said before, patients with more small airway dysfunction could benefit from those fine or ultrafine particle inhaled corticosteroids. And so in terms of overall conclusion, in my fellowship, I'm definitely learning that there is a growing role for iOS in our evaluation and monitoring of patients with asthma, especially those who cannot perform spirometry due to age or acute or severe exacerbations. It seems like the guidelines are recommending the use of increased thresholds, which definitely improves the specificity, but maybe the cost of sensitivity. And at least in our previous cohorts so far, it seems like baseline Z-scores for small airway resistance were elevated and could be the markers to look at in terms of trying to distinguish children with asthma versus those who do not. But overall, it seems like cutoff values and diagnostic thresholds that have great accuracy still remain to be determined. So thank you for your time and attention.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Yvonne. Go ahead, Jeff.
Very excellent work. I mean, well, I'll comment on the sensitivity that you're choosing with the cutoffs as recommended by the ERS ATS guidelines, being the 95% cutoff. And the discomfort that that's arisen because it's not the same as the older guidelines, which were more sensitive to detecting reversibility. And it's a choice. If you're going to choose the 95% cutoff, you're basically choosing, I only want, a false positive rate of about 5% in detecting reversibility. But that is being over selective of people who are normal, essentially, and not sensitive enough to people who are asthmatic. So we're not comfortable with that as the sensitivity, I believe is what you're saying, because we were used to the 30% cutoff, which found more asthmatics than the current cutoff. And so I think the revision, if there's going to be a revision in ERS guidelines, has to basically make it clear that there is an overlap when you're using reversibility and associating it with asthma, which isn't necessarily always the case. You're certainly detecting abnormal reversibility at a 95% cutoff. That's our usual standard. But as a tool to relate it to asthma, it's too specific, not sensitive enough. I think that's going to be the point that you're making, and I think you actually made it in one of the slides.
So I'll argue the counterpoint because, the dogma eats if you got asthma, you're talking about being on chronic controller, i.e. inhaled steroids long term. for children who might be totally asymptomatic for long periods of time. And you'd like a good reason. So I'm wondering if we should try and be more specific and sensitive.
Okay, well, we're very specific at the moment. Not enough in kids, I don't know.
Jason?
Yeah, I found it interesting that you got a significant effect in the resistance measurements, R5 and R20 and so forth, but not in AX. Is that correct? So let me ask the adult pulmonologist here. How often when you do spirometry, oscillometry in an adult asthmatic, do you see that as opposed to also getting an abnormality in AX? Because in allergic mice, I mean, I studied mice a lot, you never see isolated airway resistance, or almost never.
Hannah, do you have a feel for that? Question was, if you looked at the data enough to figure out whether you're seeing reversibility in the R5, low frequency resistance, more than you're seeing in the change in the reactants, that triangular area under the reactants curve.
When I compared patients who had a bronchitis.
Louder, please.
Louder.
Oh, sorry. When I
Or you can come up here. Come on, go, don't be shy.
Well, while she's getting up there, let me say why I asked this. Because in adult asthmatics who have an allergic phenotype, you get inflammation in the lung, which predisposes to closure. It's probably what's giving rise to the increased IMs. So I'm wondering if there's a sort of fundamentally different phenotype between the asthma in kids, particularly prepubescent kids, and adults. Put it out there.
Okay, well, we'll see. So Hannah is a second year medical student at McGill, and she's looking at bronchodilator response within my practice. So what have you found so far that you can compare?
So just preliminarily, I compared patients who had a bronchodilator response via spirometry to those who didn't have it via spirometry, their pre and post oscillometry data. And the only significant oscillometry value was the percent change in R5. Like nothing on impedance, but resistance was significant in how much those two groups changed.
And this is curious because 2 years ago, looking at asthma control and specifically both spectral and intra-breath as predictors of that, and showed very nicely that indeed oscillometry worked as previously published. For the first time, I got her to put patient-reported outcomes against asthma oscillometry parameters, and whereas in my COPD population, the reactants area and reactants was always the major link to symptoms.
Yeah.
That was not the case in the asthma. The ACQ linked better to the R5 than any other parameter. So there's a curious recurring thing with the asthmatics where the R5 seems to be where the message is, and very much different from the COPD population. So in adults as well as now children.
All right, thanks. Yeah.
We saw a big difference between interbreath and asthmatics versus the COPD and the leadation. So it's the instruction, the things that are going on in the air vary.
Yeah, so I may have to, I've been teaching, treatable traits, it's all obstructive airway disease, asthma. There seems to be something to that the old guard may have been right all those years ago. Imagine that. Funny.
Any other questions? Okay, okay. Errol, you had a question online?
Yeah, marvelous. Thank you. A very interesting presentation. And for somebody who spends half his professional life thinking about asthma diagnosis in children, all I would say is I would be slightly cautious trying to reduce, or tinker with specificity. And the question is, what is it we want to achieve? Because that is a crucial question. For example, I would say focusing on sensitivity may be another approach, because if you can identify a group of children where you can say it is highly unlikely that they have asthma, then at the very least, they don't need any more testing, providing, we can prove that this is really robust. Just lowering the threshold and saying, okay, fine, well, we now have a better sensitivity, but not so good specificity, that results then in overdiagnosis. Or you'd say all these children will still need further tests, and therefore you cannot base a diagnosis on oscillometry alone. And I think this is the difficulty we're facing in this domain, that we need to make progress to really establish this measurement in asthma diagnosis.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good point. We had very similar questions, and I think a lot of questions we were asking about were based on the results of iOS, does that change our clinical management? And so, yeah, I think all good things to consider. If there are adjustments to the guidelines in the future, I'd be interested to see where that goes.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, Yvonne. Okay, and now our last speaker before we get to lunch. And we have to, is it uploaded? Because they're online as well. Okay. And that's Samer Dadi from Boston University. I'm going to talk about lung volume and respiratory mechanics during mechanical ventilation. So Samer, are you here somewhere?
We may not.
Yeah, I don't see him.
So 1 second. We go here.
Yeah. They are. I don't see timer here. Down.
Yes. Yeah.
So Samer is Bella Sook's fellow, BU. I don't know, I don't even see Bella here. And Sama definitely not here.
You might be on time for lunch.
Well, I think they're done a spectacular job. On time.
Thank you so much. We worked hard and we achieved what we've done. So it looks like we'll have a lunch break now. Lunch is
Upstairs on the 6th floor.
okay. And we will restart promptly at 1, right? Show up a little bit before 1, be even better. Thank you.